I would like to, for the panel, to ask on the panel. I see them directly in front of me, Michael Kofman, who is from the Carnegie Endowment and is well known as the guy you need to ask when you want to learn something about the Russian army. I want to ask Jessica Berlin, and now I have to ask for help because she has so many titles from our different affiliations, the Center for European Policy and Analysis. I should mention also that Michael Kofman was also before a fellow of the Kennan Institute, if I'm right. A long time ago, and it's worth to mention because they are partners of this event. Jessica is from the Center for European Policy Analysis and also from the founder of strategy consultancy Construct, and a member of a fintech company, but more importantly here of the Ukrainian German Society board member. Welcome, Jessica. Then I should ask on the panel the former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Pavlo Klimkin, who was Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2014 to 2019. And last but not least, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, the man that for many years, for more than a decade, was the chief policy advisor on foreign affairs for Angela Merkel, Christoph Heusgen. No, I should not sit on the coffee. I feel very privileged to moderate this panel because it's a little bit setting the tone for a conference where we constantly debate about how to deal with overcoming the fear. The deputy minister already said very clearly that fear is not a good advisor, but we have to strike a balance here because in my new role in the Vilnius office of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, I think our core mission is to bring a bit more of the fear that exists in the Baltic states to Berlin. Because sometimes we have the feeling that it's not fear is a good advisor, but a little bit of alertness and sensitivity to security risks is something that is also important to get good policy decisions. While at the same time, we of course don't want to contribute to this irregular fear that leads to bad decisions, because we know that part of the support for peace, so-called support for peace in Germany, is driven by fear that the Putin regime is so overpowerful that the only way you can deal with it is hide and praise and hope that they will make a good deal with us. And so this is also driven by fear. So we need to somehow find a way dealing with this. Now, coming to the discussion, I wanted, no, I should at least deal with what we roughly agreed on. To get into the context of the debate, so I would start, because this is the starting point, I guess, for all our debate about fear and how to deal with the Putin regime at these days, is starting with where the war is fought, and that is in Ukraine. So I would ask you, Mr. Former Minister of Foreign Affairs, to give a little bit an assessment, how you evaluate the current situation in Ukraine. We saw that The Economist last week published an article saying that basically the call for victory is irresponsible, and that somehow both in Ukraine and in the West we need to adapt strategy and have more modest demands. And you, of course, know your countrymen and their ability to resist, but also the kind of horrors of this war imposing for such a long time on the population. So what is your assessment of the current situation in Ukraine?
The mic is on? Great. Let me start with 3 short points, because it's about discussion. It's not about kind of lectures or presentations. I like your point about fear, and there was one very special personality in the history of the world, but especially Central Europe, John Paul II. And actually, his slogan, his personal slogan was "Non avete paura," don't get afraid. He was able to achieve a lot personally, but changing not just the map of the Central Europe, but also the path of the European history. And now it had become a real slogan for us, for Ukraine, for Ukrainians. Some people believe we have a binary mentality. It's either yes or no, it's either victory or defeat. And it's quite helpful when you have a war around you. So it's a kind of black and white reality, and you have to go. It does not matter what's going to happen with you. For us, what's going on is existential. It's for me, the Ukrainian, it's about my country. It's about our nations, and the leadership in Moscow famously does not believe that Ukraine actually exists as a country, as a nation, in the sense of language, in the sense of statehood, basically nothing. And they tend to consider us either as a kind of wrong, ill-fated Russia or anti-Russia, as Putin stated in his article. And for me, the point about Ukraine is a game-changing point for Russia. 100 years ago, no, exactly 107 years ago, a Ukrainian statement, Volodymyr Vinnychenko said that the Russian liberalism actually ends where the Ukrainian issue starts. It's a sort of direct quote. It's not for me, the Ukrainian, to decide where the Russian liberalism should start or end up. But what I believe, it's existential for us, for Ukrainians, but it's the same way it's existential for Russia, how the Russians understand who they are and why they are the way they are, not just... We got our sense of why it matters for us to be Ukrainians, why we are as we are, and as I've said, how we are the way we are. And it's not about discussing, definition of victory or definition. For us, victory is victory. So you can play with political beats here and there, but the fundamental point is that Ukraine as a country, as a nation, should exist, should become part of Europe, part of the West. And for me, it's going to be extremely beneficial and positive also for Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I would add that for Boris Nemtsov, it was always clear that liberalism starts with the freedom also of the Ukrainian people. So as a Russian liberal that kind of took from the beginning the struggle for freedom in Ukraine as a definition point for Russian liberals. Now, when you say that The Economist basically is dealing with semantics about what is the definition, the real core question is binary. It's very helpful to put things into perspective on their side. What I would ask, I mean, this helps me. This helps me to kind of understand it better as someone from the so-called West. But what do you expect in the current situation could the West do in order to lift morals? Because we know that it's binary, yes, it's victory or defeat. That is the most important. At the end, you said also already clearly that the core mobilization comes from within Ukraine. It doesn't come from the West. It's not the question whether the West supports or not. It's at the end existential. But what could the West do to help?
I've just told Jean, I remember quite well my last conversation with Boris, and don't get offended, anybody. I said also publicly many times that I believe he was kind of last guy I personally know, I personally talked to, in the sense of someone trying to understand Ukraine and having a sense of sympathy for Ukraine. It's something which matters for me as a Ukrainian. Secondly, make Ukraine stronger. Stand with Ukraine sounds like a slogan, but make Ukraine stronger is about delivering more, not only in the sense of quantity, but also in the sense of quality. We understand it's about us to fight, but help us in our way of fighting on. Invest in Ukraine, in Ukrainian production, invest in Ukrainian military, but also economic resilience. Create a pattern where the Russian leadership is unable to draw more money and to circumvent any sanctions, and they are quite masterful on that. And actually, if you talk to many people in the world, not only in the Western world, but also non-Western world, the sense of order, the sense of precedent is important one for many, because if you break the sense of order once, basically how are you gonna deliver that it's there for us? So make Ukraine stronger. It's 1, 2, 3. It's all quite known, but it's also about sustainability. So the simple message, we are there with you, not for as long as it takes, but in the sense of to get a sense of victory, to get a sense of common victory for Ukraine and for us, would be the best message to the Russian regime there. But not in the sense of declarations, because in Moscow, political declarations are not coming down quite effectively, but in the sense of 1, 2, 3, in the sense of very simple but very effective deeds over there.
It seems simple and effective, and still it's the most difficult, I would assume, because it's easier to declare we stand with Ukraine and to deliver tanks than to mobilize the population. Big challenge in Germany, I would say. That also not all politicians have clear answers to. Now, going also into the military detail, it would be interesting, Michael, to hear, we follow in the moment in the situation where Ukraine stands firm as a population, as a country, but we see that there is a crouching offense of the Russian army, where the war of attrition seems to pay off, at least for not to win a war, but to slowly advance. And in the moment, it seems like this slow advance cannot be easily changed in dynamics. What is your assessment of the current military situation of the war of attrition at the front line?
Okay, thanks. I'll try to be brief. So I think everybody watching the war understands that the situation is quite difficult at the front, and that for the better part of the last year, Russia's held the material advantage and much of the initiative. That said, the Russian advantage hasn't been decisive. Russia has made steady gains over this time period, but they've not been able to achieve big operational breakthroughs. The Russian minimal goal remains taking the rest of the Donbass, and that clearly includes the main cities of Donetsk. So at this point, we're set up, I think, for a looming siege of Pokrovsk. But despite the difficult situation, Ukrainian forces, as though exhausted, still hold the front line. There's not been a major collapse. And I don't actually think that there is a high probability of a collapse coming. In many respects, the more difficult aspect of all of this, not to abuse that word, had been the Russian long-range strike campaign over the spring, which had destroyed a lot of Ukraine's non-nuclear power generation. The West has provided quite a bit of air defense, but it's been very late to need. The damage has already been done. And it still doesn't meet Ukraine's minimal requirements. Goes without saying, Ukraine's a very large country. Not enough air defense has been provided to defend Ukrainian infrastructure, cities, and the front. And so Ukraine has to make difficult choices between these three. And so we have an uncertain winter that looms, right? And I think that the strike campaign is probably more significant. On the other hand, on the Ukrainian side, when you look at manpower, when you look at fortifications, when you look at munitions, there had been some improvements over the course of the summer. Mobilization is yielding more people, although there are nuances and complexities there. Ukrainian forces are digging in, and the West is producing more munitions. So that the Russian fire's advantage right now is not as strong and not as heavy as what it was back during the winter and spring. Okay. Ukraine has also substantially expanded its strike campaign against Russia and is now able to inflict much more damage and cost on the Russian military and on Russian critical infrastructure as well, with their own capabilities rather than ones provided by the West. And that capacity is only going to grow. And it would expand further if the West had invested in Ukraine's defense industry, which with purchasing power parity can produce a lot more for the same amount of money. Looking forward, though, I will tell you that from my point of view, at this stage of the war, this is not a war for who controls the next 20 kilometers of the Donbass. Okay, this is important nonetheless. This is Ukrainian land, but the war is not going to be decided in the Battle of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is operationally significant, but that's about as much as I can say for it. This is now about whether or not Ukraine can effectively exhaust the Russian offensive and stabilize the front line at the peak of Russian material advantage. Russia has significant constraints. One, when it comes to equipment, they've been primarily spending through the Soviet inheritance and the Soviet legacy. That is, most of this equipment is coming out of storage, and they are trying to conserve it. So they can't afford to lose too much. Russia also has significant manpower constraints. I know many people think that because Russia has a much larger population than Ukraine, this means that Russia has very significant advantages, right? That's not the case. I'll tell you why. If it was the case, then you would have a hard time explaining Russian military performance of the last 2 years. Okay? If it's just about numbers on Excel spreadsheets, where Russia has more people and more equipment and more ammunition, then you'd have a very difficult time explaining the fairly weak performance and slow rate of advance. Why? So while Russia does have a lot more people, in actuality, Russia's been contracting these individuals, and the Russian rate of losses at the front for the last year has been quite high relative to the rate of replacement. And as you've seen payouts in Russia go up 3-4 times what they were over the past several months, it's a very good indicator that they are struggling to replace their people. Russia, as an economy, has a huge deficit of skilled labor and low productivity. And so despite the fact that Russia has far more people population-wise than Ukraine, this is true, they're not easily available, and they're also not quickly convertible into combat power. It takes a lot to generate units capable of conducting offensive operations. So the bottom line is, Excel spreadsheets don't fight. Numbers on paper don't march off of paper into reality onto the battlefield that easily. And what I'm trying to tell you is that the Russian relative advantage is actually going to decline next year, looking at manpower, looking at equipment, and also to a lesser extent looking at munitions. Yes, it'll still be there. No, Russia's not going to run out of these things, and people should not believe in these fantasies either. But if Ukraine can stabilize the front line, and if West doesn't abandon Ukraine in terms of material assistance, in terms of support, the Russian hand is actually not nearly as strong as it seems, okay? Of course, I'll close on maybe with this point. A lot depends on how the winter goes, right? A lot depends on the coming discussions and meetings, such as the DCG that got postponed that was supposed to be in Ramstein, on what Ukraine can expect in terms of commitment. There's quite a bit that hangs in terms of policies and support that might get decided in the coming months.
And is there anything that, I mean, in a way, when we listen closely to you, we hear that you say that the current Russian campaign is not about to significantly change the situation on their behalf. It's not a big breakthrough and so on, but the current attrition is happening. And the question to me is, what would be the turning point you would see, or what would be needed in order to break that current dynamic? You say it will come over next year because you laid down all the factors that will influence it. Is there anything that needs additionally to be done to change the dynamics?
I mean, there's quite a bit you could list, right? But not to be glib about it, right? This is first about Ukraine staying power, Ukraine addressing its mobilization issues, Ukraine setting up effective fortifications, stabilizing the front, and these two are interrelated. But of course, it's also about Western material support, and here this is about the fundamentals, right? Financial assistance, material assistance in terms of the numbers of equipment provided, not leaping from like game changer to game changer. I spent the last two and a half years now as an analyst having to deal with these theories that the next capability we provide is somehow going to be decisive in the war, okay? But doesn't work that way in a large-scale conventional war. It's about the cumulative effect of support, and the focus should be first and foremost stabilizing the front. Second, reconstituting Ukraine's military's capability to conduct offensive operations, not necessarily to conduct an offensive, but the threat has to be there. If Ukraine is to achieve war termination on favorable terms, then ideally the threat needs to be there for the Russian military, that they can lose.
This is partly a message also to Germans that always are hesitant with offensive capabilities.
Well, that may be true, but I'll tell you, I saw a night and day difference in the reaction between the debate about providing armor equipment like Leopard tanks in 2022 and seeing German equipment and other equipment being used in offensive operations in Russia during the Kursk offensive in August and September, to which there was almost a big shrug. So it shows you what a difference, a year makes, right? I think, speaking now as an American from Washington, D.C., we didn't have these similar qualms, but it was very interesting to see how we were in a very different conversation. Maybe Jessica wants to touch on this because she's much more involved in that debate. But suffice to say, it turns out that some of these psychological hang-ups weren't nearly as much of an issue when you look a year plus down the line. Maybe that would be the case with other capabilities, other policy restrictions on long-range strike and what have you that still remain. I think we've steadily inched forward, but still hold on to what have been relatively arbitrary lines to this in terms of where they've been drawn.
I mean, and then Michael, I take also your suggestion to go instantly into what Jessica could probably answer a little bit on the public opinion battle that happens in the West. As a dual German-American citizen, I know that you kind of are dealing with many fronts in the public opinion battle. What do you want to comment on that?
Thank you. Well, first I'll refer to a comment actually that you made before, saying that we here in Germany perhaps need to get more of the fear that our allies in the Baltics have. And I would disagree with or reframe that. Our Baltic allies aren't afraid. They understand history and they have a strategy and they're showing courage. So this is, I think, the primary difference between what we're seeing from our allies further east and in my capitals, Berlin and Washington. It is the curse of the dual citizen in a time like this.
Full agreement.
Yes. So that's a primary point. It's a very broad question. Wither public opinion. So I'll talk with a German and then an American hat on. Okay, first as a German. We of course have our psychological and historical hang-ups from the war. None of this needs to be explained. However, I think after 2.5 years, we need to stop talking about it. I don't think that's the issue, that's the driver anymore. Rather, I think there has been a political choice. There's been a political choice to not lead the country in having the conversation about what this war means for Europe and for Germany and for the world. So just by, I think a lot of foreigners will automatically say, oh, but the Germans, you know, they've got their angst about the war. No, we have a political elite, we have a political system right now where the folks who have been making the decisions on how we react to this war were also more or less the same team that were actually involved in the lead up to the war. Over the last 20 years, you know, it's been a back and forth of CDU and SPD or a combination thereof of leadership. And so our sort of malaise and the public opinion sinking in terms of its support for Ukraine, I don't think we can blame this on some historical legacy. I think we need to look the current political reality in the face and call a spade a spade. If we had had clarity and consistency from the beginning and throughout about what this war means for Germany, what this war means for Europe, and what it means for the world, the risks involved and the need for strategy, then I think the German people and the German public would have surprised us. I think people would have stood up.
Cool. I hear you loud and clearly that you basically hint to what unifies current leadership and recent leadership. I guess Christoph Heusgen needs later to comment for the history lesson because with the administrations of Angela Merkel,
yeah.
But basically that they took the war more as a policy question and less a question where the whole population needs to be debating about it, or do I understand you right?
In a way, so let's break that down. I mean, firstly, let's give some credit to regular voters. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it's in Germany or France or Canada. Most folks don't think about war and military strategy all day and don't know anything about it. And when something like this comes up, a crisis like this, it's big, it's scary, and they are either consciously or unconsciously looking for leadership in a direction to try to understand the situation and what needs to be done and what's expected of us. And when instead, in the case of Germany, where we had, the Zeitenwende speech and a big push of support in words, but then in action that didn't follow up. And then for 2 years, consistently, every time we would talk about a new capability, a new need for support from Germany, or even on a defensive side, even just in the debate about air defense, we even couldn't step up there. And all the debates and excuses, this naturally muddles the public perception of what's needed. Because if we would do if it would be really serious and Ukraine needs it and we believe in Ukrainian victory, then we wouldn't have the chancellery blocking support left and right and saying, we mustn't anger Moscow. So this is an important factor in what has led the German public debate and public opinion to be divided. And of course, huge point that we mustn't overlook, this has also basically made it open season for Russian disinformation. Germany is hugely infiltrated on that front. That's neither scandalous nor new news to say, and our government does not have a strategy to counter this. So also people are being swayed by literal Russian propaganda that is being given a very open space in our society. To your second point around, I would just use the Tagespolitik has been driving, like the day-to-day politics and day-to-day policy work has always taken priority in Berlin. We don't really have a foreign policy strategy in this country. And haven't for a long time. I think not having a strategy was kind of the strategy. If you would ask a German in the last 10 years in the foreign ministry, what is our strategy? What are Germany's goals in the world? You would get some speech about rights and advancement and you know, sort of peace, joy, and pancakes kind of answer. That's a German phrase, by the way. Apologies to the non-German speakers in the room. But those aren't goals, and it's certainly not a strategy, because a strategy means steps, plan, implementation, tactics. And now we've suddenly entered a time where we can't just kick the strategic can down the road. Our security can't just be taken advantage or taken for granted through our allies. See the Americans. And also there is a real threat, a clear and present danger virtually on the doorstep, just a half a day's drive from here. So we haven't actually, I think, overcome not the historical issues, but the day-to-day modern political issues of lack of strategy, lack of leadership, and quite frankly, lack of courage and responsibility in this country.
I mean, honestly, there is so much food of thought from what you said, because you partly commented on something that was decisive probably in recent elections in Germany, because the war and peace talk was one of the topics, and because there was no perceived leadership on that on the side of sanity and for freedom, it also had a quite negative effect. And what you say now is quite interesting with the lack of strategy, because as we all know, there's a sentence of the Boston Consulting Group that says, strategy is what you don't do, and strategy is what you don't do is one reason why many people never have strategy, because deciding that you don't do certain things means that you have to deal with the fear of making a mistake. And this fear of making a mistake is kind of like what you describe in German culture, in policy culture. It's quite interesting, and now because it would be very interesting how Christoph Heusgen will respond to that. Because to be fair, on the on the criticizing Angela Merkel for not having been taking more of a leadership role, we have also to remind ourselves that she was at a time where German public opinion was far from supporting sanctions. She really took leadership, and under the good advice of her foreign policy advisor Christoph Heusgen, was also kind of rallying allies in the European concert in order to pass sanctions that at that time surprised Putin, and still Nord Stream 2 was signed and so on. So I think I allow you probably to comment on this. First, very interesting point of Jessica of a lack of strategy, how this can be overcome, and kind of what your lesson from history is, kind of what the German government should do now.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me, and it may surprise you, but I subscribe to everything what Jessica said before. Actually, I wrote a book recently about Germany having to assume more responsibility and leadership as a consequence of what is happening worldwide. But I don't want to get into that. But you know, Pavlo and I probably met Pavlo during a certain period more often than I met my wife, when we were doing you know, the Minsk agreement and tried to implement the Minsk agreement at the time, which, if you, now everybody criticizes it, but basically what was possible at the time with German leadership, by the way, because she took basically François Hollande, Poroshenko and Putin by the hand and asked, well, we have to see how do we get at a diplomatic solution. And at the time, it was possible to stop at least the Russian advance. At the time, I remember the Chief of Defense of Ukraine saying in Minsk, we need this agreement. If we don't have Minsk, then the Russians will advance all the way to Kiev. So I think it was a good piece of diplomacy. What happened afterwards and what then today is debated, but what is very clear for somebody who has negotiated it and knows it exactly, Russia didn't implement it. They didn't implement paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And they never planned to implement it, but at least we were at the time able to stop the advance. Now, we then worked very hard to try to implement the agreement. We saw how the difficulties were. I don't want to go into it. In any case, what we then lived was the 24th of February. And for me today, having negotiated all this and having thought, well, we have to see to it that we somehow, through diplomatic means, get to an agreement. My conclusion is we have tried everything. The Russians have just destroyed everything possible, not only Minsk, but Budapest Memorandum, the CSC Founding Act, the Charter of Paris, the UN Charter. They have destroyed everything. So negotiation will not lead to a result if it's not paired with strength. And I think this is the key. On the military side, but also economically, the only way that we can end this war is if we have Ukraine in a position of strength. And we have right now, when you look at the situation, I'm very grateful for Michael, what he said about the military situation. You have in Germany right now a kind of defeatism. People believe, well, we cannot win this war. Ukraine is not there now, and therefore, since we cannot win this militarily, we have to go to negotiations. I mean, Putin will laugh at that, and he has said, well, only because Ukraine doesn't have any weapons doesn't mean we stop the war, So he wants to continue, and he sees this as a sign of weakness. So we have to overcome that, and I agree with Michael that the situation is not that bad here. My member of my team wrote me down a few figures which Germans probably don't know. Russia spends 40% of its state budget on its military. This is not sustainable. The gas revenue is declining. Gazprom had for the first time in 23 a loss, first loss since 99. Russia has announced the steepest tax hike since Putin came to power. Then the banks have more and more problems to finance the economy, and there's labor shortage. 20% of the positions in the police force are not filled because too many people are either on the battlefield or have fled the country. So let's be optimistic. I mean, we were able to win the Cold War. In my young years, I was I worked for COCOM. Only the older people know this is a coordinating committee that coordinates the sanctions against the Soviet Union. It was successful. I mean, Helmut Schmidt, Social Democrat, same party as the present chancellor, carried through the NATO double-track decision, which in the end was responsible for crumbling, for getting the Soviet Union down. So it's out of a position of strength that we should operate and should not have this defeatism. And therefore, I think we have to believe in Ukraine. We have to believe also in the strength of our alliance, in the strength of what we can do. The CSU has just announced for the first party in Germany that we go to 3% of defense percentage GDP. I was surprised to hear that, but this is a first good signal, and we have to go into this direction and get out of this defeatism. And I also agree with Jessica with regard to the disinformation. I mean, it's incredible how Russia is with its disinformation going. We do, last point, we have to have a position of strength. We have to explain it. We do with the Munich Security Conference what we call the Zeitenwende on tour. We have been at 26 cities. I come from Frankfurt Oder last night. I can tell you it's a tough decision, but you have to carry these to the to the people. We were in Leipzig, we were in Chemnitz, we were in Rostock, we were in Lutherstadt, and it's a tough decision, but you have to go there. And the people tell me you are the first ones who actually come here and discuss that. So let's be more positive. We're going to win this.
Great. I mean, also for going for. I should say also for that you come back from Frankfurt Oder now. Thank you for your service, because this is actually exactly what we need to do more. When you said about public opinion partly being afraid that Ukraine cannot win this war. This is part of the disinformation effort. This is partly what the TikTok videos of the Kremlin machine kind of present every day. But I wonder really, and that's interesting more technically. I mean, strategy, you clear, but technically, for example, disinformation. When NATO meets and discusses the hybrid war, then the German Ministry of Defense has to say, it's not our responsibility because in Germany it's the Ministry of Interior that is responsible for disinformation, and it's not the Ministry of Defense, and that leads to lots of strange reactions in other countries because Germans, in this case, once more, seem to live partly in a world of formalities that are not adapted to the real threat level, and so it would be interesting to hear from you what kind of strategic advice also you can give to the government on the more practical side.
Well, it's pretty simple. It's something that I fought for, but unsuccessfully. We need to have a National Security Council. Germany is one of the few countries that doesn't have that. We don't have that because we have coalition governments, and whoever is in the foreign ministry hates it because they believe that the National Security Council would strengthen the Prime Minister's office, which in practice is happening anyway. I mean, decisions also on which weapons go to Ukraine. Do we send Taurus or not? The decision is not made in the Defense Ministry. It's not made in the Foreign Ministry. It's made in the Chancellery. So why not recognize this and have a National Security Council where you have this discussion on a higher level, and then you get all the different actors together, and we need that. I hope that with the next government we'll have it, but I've been hoping that for many years. But we still have all the different actors different separately. Also, not on this issue, but Germany also. I hope there is nobody from the Ministry of Economic Cooperation here, but Germany is one of the last countries that has an independent Ministry of Economic Cooperation, where they spend the money totally independent of what the political foreign policy strategies of the foreign ministries are. You know, this is Germany, a federal country, a coalition country where everybody does what he or she wants. And you can do that, you know, when the sun shines, but when there is wind blowing in your face, you have to get your act together. You know?
Yeah, I mean, full agreement. But I say this with a very low voice because it was the Liberals that called for ending the Economic Cooperation Ministry in the past to merge it with the Foreign Ministry. And when the Liberals went into government with the Christian Democrats, they didn't do it. And I hope that in the future we will do it. Thank you very much. Also, when you talk about the disinformation and the debate with public opinion, it would be interesting. One thing I forgot to ask Jessica is, because the West is not only Germany, whether you could say 2 words about the public opinion in the US, because in the US we have currently this war and peace questions, also as part of the public debate. Also the US were hesitant at the beginning to deliver offensive weaponry to Ukraine. So could you just say a few words about that?
Sure. In the US, as in Germany and every country, foreign policy is never the main priority of the voting public. And for Americans, you can also have a bit of sympathy. Europe, for them, is far away. Most Americans don't even have a passport. So there was a real hurdle to be overcome to get folks to find Ukraine on the map and care. That was done, and the courage that the Ukrainian people and armed forces showed, this really swept the nation. The folks were watching and caring. But similarly to here, when the Biden administration then failed to act decisively, let's say, in the first year.
Explain it decisively, right?
We had an opportunity, we now with my American hat on, the United States had an opportunity in the first year of the full-scale invasion to end the war. American power had that capacity to set red lines, to establish no-fly zones that wouldn't risk, by the way, harming a single Russian pilot, just simply to say we're going to shoot down any missiles fired at Ukrainian airspace. I mean, this could have been done in the early stages. That threat could have been made and put through, and that would have been transformative. Mike may correct me here, but this is certainly not beyond the capacity of the U.S. military. And furthermore, as the first year drew on into the winter, the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces were still under equipped with munitions to attack Russian lines that were literally digging in across 1,000 miles of front over that winter, we basically, in the U.S., we missed an opportunity to, through giving huge material support to the Ukrainians at the start, prevent a Russian digging in an entrenchment of the front line. And in terms of public opinion, I think also in the U.S., they have a very different relationship to war. But what we're seeing in the U.S. is they were just getting over 20 years of the war on terror. And I won't even go into all the folly and hubris and mistakes of that era. But just months after the fall of Kabul, for the Biden administration to be in this situation, they wanted to move on from international conflict as a loser topic also, as an administration for the voting public. So how do you get the Americans to care about another war far away when we just finally got extracted from these really deeply unpopular and strategyless, pointless wars, you could say?
And where they used up all the good words like the axis of evil, they at that time used for an axis of evil that didn't exist because Iran, Iraq, and North Korea weren't cooperating. And now they are. Right.
And the clear and present danger to the American people from Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, I'm sorry, they spent trillions fighting that. But now with the actual much more concrete and tactile and global threat coming from Russia, to not be able to counter that with even a fraction of the power that's at America's disposal. I think that's a real challenge. And once again, now, I mean, I don't want to say the T word, but with the upcoming election, with the possibility of a second Trump administration, it would have actually been even more critical, I think, for the Biden administration to use this past year to increase support, both in speed and volume, to Ukraine, to both on a just simple, obvious level to help the Ukrainians more, but also to basically shore up the familiarity and the acceptance of the U.S. public going into this election, that's showing, look, Ukraine succeeds when we help them more. And just drawing that simple corollary in the public's mind. Helping Ukraine makes us win. Yep. Americans love winners, but the way the Biden administration, I think, has handled this has been far too waffly for that American love of winning, and it's been easy then for the MAGA Republicans to attack him when he does something, and then for others to attack him when he doesn't do something. So we can only look ahead. post-November when we see what happens there.
It's very interesting because what you describe is, again, relating to the topic overcoming the fear. And what Pavlo said at the beginning, what is more needed in the West, that there is kind of like not only stand with Ukraine slogans and kind of promises of hard stuff, but also clarity on leadership and communication with the population, with the kind of psychological part of things. But Mike, I would give you the chance also to comment on that, because partly you're an American, but partly because as a military analyst, you also these days have to deal with the impact of disinformation, and kind of part of military tactics have become also more hybrid. And so it would be very interesting how do you see this kind of hybrid military operation of Russia being successful? We heard it several times, that kind of some of the arguments that are strong in the public opinion in the US or in Germany specifically are also kind of at least spreading the same messages as the hybrid warriors of the troll factories of the Kremlin, and so it would be interesting whether you price this in your military analysis. Is there any way that kind of we can win the war on that front?
So I'm going to disappoint you. I'm probably the wrong person to ask this. I don't work on disinformation all that much. I'll tell you first, from my point of view, the biggest problem is not disinformation or misinformation. It's that most people don't know much about military matters. And across Europe, a class of folks that used to work on conventional warfare, nuclear strategy, has diminished significantly. And so it's been harder to have that conversation with people over the last 2.5 years about what is required and what is needed to be done to win a large-scale conventional war in Europe. This is issue one. Issue two, I don't know how effective Russian disinformation really has been. Usually folks, when they see a lot of activity, particularly government folks, they assume that there is achievement there, okay? But I don't know if the metrics on that really deliver in terms of what's accomplished to Russia. Maybe more here in Europe and maybe much more here in Germany than is in the United States. This could be very much more of an American perspective. Lastly, so wars are fundamentally contests of wills. They are human endeavors, right? And much comes down to perception. Two military communities, two political cultures or leaders could look at the same situation on the ground, and come with very different conclusions and interpretations about the military balance and who's winning, right? And so it has been a challenge, speaking from an analytical perspective, to continue to argue for the facts or for the objective evidence as it is available, because over the course of this war, and it's in part because of how it's covered by colleagues in journalistic circles who I very much appreciate and see as a kind of maybe adjacent profession. You know, the discussion on this war has basically been a series of alternating narratives between gloom and doom and unrealistic euphoria and optimism, okay? And even what I say, I feel I say one thing, but people hear something else. And what they usually hear is one of those two things no matter what I said. They either hear a degree of gloom and doom, it's pessimistic, or they're very optimistic. They're like, hey, we're back, maybe things are not so bad. And actually, it's been very hard because as an analyst, I'm pretty conservative to maintain folks on an even keel, right? That things are not nearly as bad as they look. They're also not that rosy or optimistic either. But unrealistic expectations, euphoria, particularly in late 2022, was unhelpful, I felt, in the assumptions and expectations laid for the 2023 offensive and how it was planned. On the one hand, that's true. On the other, a degree of defeatism and fatalism had led to, I would say, three series of maybe not narratives. I hate this term, it's overly abused. But I would say threads, cognitive threads that I've seen over the course of this war amongst decision makers. The first is that doing something won't make a difference and therefore it doesn't matter, okay? It does. If war is a contest of wills, Ukraine has the will to fight. That's a necessary condition, prerequisite, but it's not enough to succeed. And when somebody has the will to fight, then things can make a difference. okay, in terms of material assistance. The second is that there's no point investing something because the war will be over by then. I saw this a lot in Europe. Europeans waited about 13 months to make major investments in the production of munitions, and that is why, that's not entirely why, but it's part of the reason, it's a contributing reason, why we are where we are today. It's because the right investments weren't made by us and by Europe. In the latter part of 2022, when it became clear that the Russian leadership had invested in a protracted conventional war in terms of mobilization, defense industrial mobilization, and the resources they were committing, right? And we waited too long to begin committing these resources. And a number of things weren't done because people felt it doesn't matter because the war will be over by then, we don't need to make these investments now. But wars go on much longer than people hope or expect, okay? And it does matter over the long run. And the third part, of course, is that certain things will prove to be escalatory, right? And this was particularly a factor early on in the war in 2022, and it was probably quite relevant during this time period. Although I will quibble with some folks over the counterfactuals of what could have been done in 2022, just to say that, look, believe it or not, it takes quite a bit of time and effort to build the training capacity, transfer equipment, have a maintenance plan for it, find in Ukraine the excess force capacity to create these additional units. And as we saw in 2023, you cannot make brigades that are going to be combat effective in 3 to 4 months. It takes a lot longer than people think. So what I will say is that we could have done a lot more, and we could have done it faster and better on behalf of Ukraine early on in 2022. But I want to caution people on believing that there's a counterfactual history here where we could have magically wanted a wholly different army and set of capabilities in that year so quickly. And a lot of that, the actual ability to do this was established during 2022, during that year, that then enabled us to do it in 2023. So we could have moved faster on it. I'm just not sure that, you know, this could have, let's say it's a debatable issue on the counterfactual for that year. And we'll debate that history for a long time. Like, we still debate what happened in World War I and World War II. We're going to be spending a long time debating what happened in this war. Okay, but lastly on disinformation. I'm not dismissive of it, and I don't want to tell you at all it's unimportant. But as an analyst since 2014, and this is just one American analyst perspective, I've been consistently frustrated by the fact that many European colleagues wanted to spend their time talking about hybrid war, build hybrid war centers of excellence, have hybrid war panels, okay, and not invest in conventional military capability, not invest in defense industrial production capacity, okay? And this continued through into this war, all right? And all this stuff is important. And it's actually going to become more important as you see Russian subversion and sabotage campaign expand across Europe over the last 2.5 years. But I really wish we spent a lot more time on this boring conventional warfare and defense industrial capacity stuff. I really do. Because if we had, we would actually be in a different position in this war today.
Thank you very much for this voice of clarity. That the war is at the end won on conventional capacities as well. Here I wanted to say, because I see the first hands getting up, there's also the possibility of a feedback function in the app, and that's very important, especially for our audiences that are online, because the majority of participants are not in this room here, but in other places, and watch this online. So please use that. I don't know exactly how I get into the discussion.
You have to open the application.
I have the application open.
And then in the service section, so you can get your question.
Okay, then I will open the survey sections and see kind of your input. I wanted just to finish this round, and then we open for the discussion. But you have a comment that directly attached to that.
To the entire panel, yes.
Okay, then I wait for that. I wait for the comment, because I wanted first, Christoph Heusgen, you heard this. We need to focus on conventional military, But at the same time, sorry, Mike, you said not only that, you also said how big the effect of the psychological situation is. This gloom and doom and hyper optimism also guided strategic decisions. And these guidance of strategic decisions by psychology is somehow also affected by the hybrid war that is going on. And it's very interesting to hear from you, Mr. Heusgen, the question, how do you see the necessity to become stronger on that front? Because sometimes we have the feeling that on the Western side, the only answer to the disinformation debate is that NATO, European Union, Germany, and so on create fact-checking websites. And there is no kind of even thinking, like in the Cold War, that we somehow need to reach Russian citizens or soldiers, that we need to have in this information war also offensive capacities, that we somehow need to also fight in this war offensively and not only create fact-checking websites that don't even reach the hearts and minds of normal people.
Yes, many things to say. Number one, I'm totally agree that we have to have conventional weapons, and there again, 2014 was the after Crimea. There was a NATO summit in Wales, and there was a commitment by all NATO governments, including the German government, with Merkel, with Steinmeier, foreign minister, and von der Leyen, defense minister, that we would spend 2% on GDP. So, firm commitment, but then when you go down the road, you come into the normal budget process, and then you have the alternatives, and where do you spend it more on defense or social issues, infrastructure, whatever, and in the end we haven't delivered. Now in 2022 the Chancellor gave this famous Zeitenwende speech and said, we're now going to do 2%, we're going to do the 100 million. The 100 billion was done, but when you look at the budget, the 2%, we are not there. We are again in the same trap almost as we were after 2014. The decision is not taken, and the debate in society, how much value do we put on military, is not conducted because people are afraid. And this is something which I don't think is something we should take for granted and natural, because when was Chancellor Scholz the most popular? Why is our defense minister right now the most popular? Because there were, Scholz in his speech was very clear, and he took people with him. And then afterwards, through whatever influence party or whatever, calmed down, and the last elections were about peace and not about security. And then, of course, you wonder why the population is no longer in the spirit of. But if everybody says, well, we have to do it, the threat is real, we have to do 2%, this is, Ukraine is defending our freedom and security, then I think people would follow. There's
no coincidence that the most popular politician in Germany currently is Pistorius,
yes,
who is the Minister of Defense, and he is clear.
Very clear. Also on Leopard tank, when Leopard tanks was debated and the Chancellor said no, a majority was also against it. When he changed his view and said, okay, we sent Leopard tanks, then all of a sudden a majority was in favor. So the government can do a lot. On disinformation, we have discussed it. I think we should try more, but this is more for the Russians here, also see what can we do in counter-offense. I think YouTube, there is still possibility where you can penetrate Russia. I think there are possibilities how you can still try to have a counter narrative. But I think we shouldn't have too high hopes. I don't know, anybody listened this morning to the Deutschlandfunk where we had Lev Gutkov, the head of Levada, and he was very clear that basically the Russian mindset is so much infiltrated by the disinformation or the information campaign by the Kremlin that it's very difficult to turn that around.
Yeah, I mean, there's some pessimistic views. Lev Gutkov has already long from his from his polls. But then, at the other hand, I would say Olga Schorina, with her talk show on Deutsche Welle, has 70% of the audience still in Russia. And the big question is, on the other hand, also, is it worth the investment? I know, and this is why I want to give the last word on the panel before I open it for the discussion to Pavlo Klimkin, is it worth investing, trying to reach people in Russia? I mean, in a way you do it in the moment because you sit on this panel and the majority of our listeners online are in Russia. But is it worth this investment? Because there's a general sentiment and in Ukraine, which I fully understand, in this black and white war, that kind of to focus on the front line and not on the Russian people, because they are seen as just complicit.
Yeah, sure. If you ask any Ukrainians whether it's kind of Putin war or Russian war, they would say, sure, both, actually. And it's not just political or emotional point. It's something which became very entrenched. I don't believe any opinion polls in Russia, but in the sense of tendency, you can follow it. But trying to reach to people and to explain your point, to make your point, actually fighting is also making our point. It's what we can do and what we will be doing. Western support is also kind of reaching out, although in an indirect way, to the Russians. Whether it would bring a real result, we don't know. But what we need with the whole discussion, especially here, is a winning mentality. Because without winning mentality, you don't believe in the future. And if you do, you have a chance. Winning mentality in the sense, yes, we can. And if you believe in some moment in time, there is a temptation to reach a kind of new, modus vivendi, it's one way of seeing things. And if you believe you need to win, and fundamentally how the new reality could start, it's fundamentally different. So keep reaching, yes, but keep reaching not in the sense of creating this message, and not like the Russian machine engaging in all this disinformation, and actually quite effectively. Because we are learning by doing. But they are also learning in the sense of getting better in everything what they do, whether it's Western world or non-Western world. And the fundamental problem for our reality is to understand that security is actually value. And it's not a value in the Western world so far. Us Ukrainians got through all this sequence of events to understand that our security, our existence, is a value. Whether the West in some moment in time gets the point that actually Ukrainian security is a value for the West, otherwise you should be prepared for everything. We are talking about investments, about 2%, 3%, whatever. What I learned in my political career or diplomatic career, it's not about planning the future. You have to be prepared for everything. And it's about your sense on how you do resilience. Christoph has mentioned Helmut Schmidt. He famously said, if you have a vision, go to a doctor. I don't challenge German strategic culture here, yeah? Of the lack of strategic culture. But we need to have a vision, and it should be a winning vision. And this winning mentality, this winning vision should be definitely communicated to the Russians. Whether we believe it could be done today or tomorrow and some moment in time, the simple point that we believe in our victory, and this victory should be a positive sense for Russia, not for the Russian regime, because I don't get them at the same level, but for Russia, it's an important point.
Thank you very much. I mean, we should add to that Helmut Schmidt at that point was also kind of a small supporter of a man with a mission, which at that time was another man, was Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was the one who had a very clear, outspoken vision that was highly criticized in Germany at that time, because they said it's a crazy cowboy, whatever, and which ceased to be the successful winning mentality you describe. Thank you so much. Now I will gather questions. I see the first two men here, yeah, and please introduce you quickly, and I have 1-2 afterwards. I see you as well.
Right, thank you. I'm Volodymyr Dubovik. I'm a senior fellow with the Center of European Policy Analysis, but also professor of national relations in Odessa, Ukraine, Odessa, which has been hammered now in several nights in a row, including some painful strikes at the sport facilities, including last night, and also Dot, a scholar here in Germany. What a great panel. I mean, I really enjoyed it. Kudos to the organizers for doing it. You know, I can only enhance or reinforce the message of the panel, which is, by the way, very well balanced. 2 Germans, 2 Ukrainians. Mike, we can't you in on this one. So there's a Ukrainian here. So I think that Economist articles you mentioned, it's a bit strange piece, but you need to read it through in its entirety. And it says the call for victory is responsible if you don't give Ukrainians the tools to win. Right, so unless you give them the tools to win, then it's irresponsible. So that's a good point, because what I'm witnessing in the last few months, it's a kind of a vicious circle in conversation between Kyiv and Kyiv partners. You know, Ukrainians are being asked, like, what do you plan to do in the war in the coming stage? And they say, that depends on what kind of assistance you give us. And that goes again and again, like, but can you win? Yes, we can win if you give us the tools, right? And that's why Zelensky was in America, and now he was, of course, planning to be here today for Rammstein tomorrow. Hopefully it takes place, because he wants to see tete-a-tete, like, what are you realistically can actually divulge and give to Ukraine now, so we can plan whatever we do in this war. And you know, there are many shades of win and lose in this war, clearly. For the outside war, for us Ukrainians, is the only one. It's a fair peace. You know, I mean, that's the only one, a just, a fair peace that we can restore our territorial integrity. So when we hear this morning on the way to this conference that 45% of Germans, according to the recent sociological polls, think that Ukraine should trade land for peace. I mean, of course, first thing first, there's a problem with that, the very concept of land for peace. Does it really work? None of us in Ukraine want to be in a situation similar to Munich conference, but not your conference, but one of September, October 1938, when people said, okay, 20% of Czechoslovakia, they're going to be fine without 20% of Czechoslovakia, so it's going to be for the sake of European security, or Minsk III, or Visegrad, or Budapest memorandum, you know, none of that. So basically, I appreciate your message, sense of urgency, double down on helping Ukraine. That's what you want to be done, but what is your most realistic expectation about what is going to be happening in the coming months? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also for putting this in perspective. Mr. Bütikofer.
Good morning. My name is... Good morning. My name is Reinhard Bütikofer, former MEP. I recently joined CEPA also. You chose the title International Security in Times of War, not European security. So let me prod you a little bit to go beyond the European theater and look at the international dimensions there. I think it was Secretary of State Blinken who described China as the chief facilitator of Russia's war of aggression. The word China has not been uttered yet on this panel. Maybe you want to comment on the role they play as you see it and how we deal with that role. And also with regard to developments in countries that are often called the Global South, I think this war has had a great impact, and there are narratives being developed that are then turned against the US and against Europe. And how do you look at that? Thank you.
Very good point, because we were running out of time. I just go very quickly. I allow all three more questions, and then everybody on this panel chooses for a last statement how to react to that. But very good point. We plan to do that, running out of time, because of course the big axis between Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea is something very relevant to us. So please, one, okay. Yeah, one there. And please be brief.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Ivan. I represented a unique organization because we united Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian people who supported people who against regime Putin and Lukashenko in country. Yeah, and I have a question for all participants, but maybe directly for Mr. Klimkin. Very interesting, your opinion. It was obviously the stable democracy in Russia is a call of international security. In your opinion, what should be the Ukrainian strategy for helping Russian civil society in this matter? It is also interesting to hear about such German and USA strategy for other experts.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I wonder whether it's an answerable question, please. Yeah, and then we, because I would argue that in the times of war, it's not Ukraine's responsibility. But
sorry, I just want to make a comment, but make it later, maybe after panelists answer the questions.
Okay.
Because my topic is quite important. I would like just to.
Yeah, but very brief. We already ran out of time. So,
yeah, I see. Okay. My name is Boris Bondarev. I'm a former Russian diplomat, and I just to make a link between international security in times of war with this NEMTSOV Forum today topic, appeasement and resistance. And we discussed this conventional war, but nobody ever mentions the nuclear factor. The nuclear factor, Russia is a nuclear country, and this feeds this fear, which we must to overcome. And this nuclear factor of Russia is a very bad but very effective advisor, as Mr. Minister Lindner says that fear is a bad advisor, but sometimes today it seems to be only advisor that current government, Western governments prefer to listen to, right? And there is some news that Putin considered in 2022 to deploy tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but they didn't do it. But there is always an option that these weapons can be used.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that must be taken into account, and that this fear must also be overcome.
Thank you very much. The nuclear question into the answers of the panel. I will go here. Last one, Nikolaus. Not Nikolai, but Nikolaus von Twickel, LibMod.
Thank you. Yes, Center Liberal Modernity, Nikolaus Twickel. I have a very short question about the military situation on the ground, maybe to Michael, but whoever wants can answer. Because we all know that Donbass is now under very strong pressure, and I just want to ask you, if Russia takes Sloviansk and Kramatorsk and takes the whole Donbass with this, how quick can they get to Dnipro? When would Dnipro fall? And from Dnipro, could they sprint to Kiev? Or can Ukraine, in the current military situation, put up meaningful fortifications to stop such a further advance?
Thank you very much. So everybody has found something to answer. We cannot say that we need to answer all questions. So I give each of you a brief last message, because all the important things you already said. And now you answer to the concrete questions. Mike, I just go one by one here. Yeah.
Okay. So briefly, yeah, I wouldn't start panicking about Russia going to Dnipro. It's going to take them quite a long time to even take Pokrovsk, let alone Kramatorsk, Slavyansk. And a lot depends on whether or not the Russian offensive potential is exhausted over the coming months into the winter in those fights. But I wouldn't have a fatalistic or an overly panicky outlook on the situation. Regarding strategy, Volodymyr, very good question. I think The challenge we've had for a long time in the war is we're making strategy at best on a 6-month basis. And when the offensive failed last summer, we started trying to do long-term planning, but this was sabotaged by the supplemental debate because we didn't have the resources. So we're going back and forth with Ukrainian colleagues who saying, what's the plan for 2024? And Ukraine would say, well, when are we going to get the supplemental, the resource? We say, I don't know. It's stuck. We're a democracy, and it's stuck in the political process. So when we finally did get them, we started aligning strategy. But I think the challenge has been that, to be honest, Western policy, and now speaking more from a US perspective, has been adrift since 2023. There's not a great theory of success for how to achieve war termination for Ukraine on favorable terms. There isn't even, I would say, a really great theory for how to compel Russia to the negotiating table, which is the first part of that strategy, what it should be. And there isn't a great alignment or understanding, I think, on the part of the West between the resources that will be required to do that. We've been consistently unrealistic about what we're going to have to invest and the resources we're going to have to provide in order to attain that in this war. But there's also been a challenge, as always, aligning strategy with Ukrainian colleagues and having them be realistic about what they can expect and when as well. I was hopeful that the Kursk offensive, while clearly signaling a departure in terms of strategic vision on the one hand, would be a useful prompt, right? And Ukraine has attempted to use it as such in the last couple of weeks. I don't know how well it's gone, but let's wait for the outcomes of these conversations and for the DCG, right? It's currently in the works in the process, and hopefully we can get on the same page on some of these issues.
But thank you very much, because then your last comment is a call again for clear strategy, how to get to this negotiation. Thank you so much, Mike. Jessica.
To the nuclear question, no. Russia's not going to nuke New York if Ukraine retakes Donbass or Crimea. No, we're not scared. Next question. The international aspect. No, I'm switching over now to this topic on interest of time. We can talk at coffee if you like. The international aspect, so this would be a topic for a whole conference unto itself, but in short, absolutely. China is Russia's #1 supporter at this time. North Korea and Iran are massively supplying ammunitions and even troops who are assisting with the maintenance of those systems at this point. The good news is, when we talk about this new crink axis of evil, it's not as coordinated as the media would, I think, put it out there. I think I would consider it more of an axis of opportunity for evil. They have seen the West waffle and lack a strategy and be indecisive, and so incrementally, they've sought their advantages where they could take them, and they saw, for example, that there's no risk to them, that they suffer no real consequences for their support for Russia, and so they continue. And I remember at the beginning, folks were saying in 2022, oh, the Chinese are being so quiet, that means they haven't decided whose side they're on. And I just had to laugh. I was like, no, silence in Chinese, and I used to live in China, I speak Chinese, silence in Chinese doesn't mean what silence means in English. You know, they're watching and waiting and seeing what we do, and then they will react. But their side was clear from day one, from day zero. So if we want to reduce the risks coming from Chinese, Iranian, and North Korean involvement, and certainly Chinese threats in the South China Sea and to Taiwan, we need to show them that there are consequences for their actions. And until we do that, they will continue to carry on and continue to escalate. And in terms of the rest of the world, also perhaps more for the coffee break, but I've been working, for example, on spread of Wagner, now rebranded to Africa Corps, on the African continent. And if we think disinformation campaigns and hybrid warfare are effective in Europe, well, it's open season in Africa. And the West is basically doing nothing to even try to counter it. I had a conversation in State Department about this, and somebody actually said to me, oh no, we're not doing nothing. VOA is still operating down there. So let's just say there's a lot more to be done.
Thank you so much for both opening up the next debate, which is kind of the big debate about the global questions, which Reinhard Bütikofer rightfully pointed to, but at the same time pointing to the fact that this new axis of evil or opportunity for evil is actually also waiting for the answer what happens in Ukraine. So thank you for this clarity. Christoph.
Yes, thanks. There was one specific question put to me, but I didn't understand it, so we have to do it over coffee. On China, Mr. Bütikofer is a specialist, so I was surprised that you asked a question which you probably have the best answer yourself. Basically, John McCain said about 10 years ago, Russia will become China's gas station. And I think this is what is happening right now. And at the same time, China is pressing Russia. They don't get the same margins as we gave them at the time. As I said, Gazprom is now running deficits. And China will, exactly as Jessica said, they will try how far they can get. They want Russia to succeed, they want Putin to stay in power, but they see what kind of costs do they have to pay. And since the economy in China is in a bad shape, I think more pressure by the US, also by the Europeans, saying, well, we watch what you are doing and we're going to put some sanctions on some companies. I think the Americans are doing it partly. I think we should be tougher. And then I think they will step back. They see how far they can go. Global South, just one remark. This opens a new chapter, but having been at the UN and been still very active there, I just see how we are losing the war with double standards, with what we hear in New York also with regard to the Middle East, the position that we take, the US takes, Germany takes on the Middle East. The attack that we are applying double standards is very tough, and this makes it very, very difficult. And there we have to go by the rule of law, international law. This has to be the yardstick. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So the call for kind of keeping the values and our rule of law inside the clarity of our answer. Thank you very much. Pavlo, you have the last word.
Hopefully. On China, the Chinese see Russia now as their strategic asset. It does not mean they kind of like Russia, that you have to ask yourself a question, how much China do you like in Russia? It's a very simple point, and I understand that some Russians started asking this question. In the sense of nukes, any use of nuke would open up the last Pandora box. So no constraints, no regrets. It's gonna be a different world, and also for the Chinese, because everybody around China has potential. Intellectual, scientific, financial, to get nuclear in 5 years without any problem. So what kind of world would it be for China? It's a big point for them. And civil society learning. I believe it's for the Russian civil society, and actually to define what does civil society in Russia means. As Ukrainians, we are famous to go to the end. If it's a Orange Revolution or Maidan, we never stop. We believe it's a kind of winning mentality. We believe if we stop, so it's nothing what could go out of it. In the sense of Russian civil society, I believe it should be a totally new strategy, because it's a fundamentally different reality you are in. It should be about new leaders. And what I've said at the beginning, don't get afraid. It's something which is again about winning mentality. Within Russia, there could be also a different kind of winning mentality. And it's a different reality with AI and all kind of stuff. So learning from us, I'm not sure. But doing something fundamentally different from what you kept doing for all these years, why not? But it's a point for you, not for me.
Thank you so much, because the last statement you made was also exactly attacking, again, fear and you came back to the winning mentality, and both on the different front lines that we have here. So I have now to excuse myself as a moderator that we overtook a little bit of time, and it was because we started also a little bit late, but also because there were so important things to say. At sharp 11:50, we start the next panel here, sharp, and I bet you to be sharp, and thank you so much for this amazing, inspiring panel.